You ever stood at your own front door and realized you no longer had a key that fit the lock? That happened to me on a Tuesday morning in October. Not in a dream, not in some story I read somewhere. It happened to me, Evelyn Marsh, 63 years old, standing on the porch of the house I had paid off 17 years earlier, watching my son's wife pull the curtain back just far enough to see who was knocking, and then let it fall closed again. She knew it was me. Of course she knew. I want to tell you this story because I think some of you have felt something like it. Maybe not exactly this, but that particular kind of pain that isn't sharp. It doesn't cut you clean. It's more like weight. Like you've walked fully clothed into very cold water and you're not drowning, not yet. But everything is so heavy you can't imagine ever feeling dry again. I'm going to start at the beginning because the ending, the part that still surprises me when I think about it, only makes sense if you understand how we got there. My husband, Frank, died in the spring of 2004. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the last morning, I sat beside his hospital bed holding his hand while the monitor went quiet. He was 58 years old. He had been planning to retire the following year. We had talked about driving the Pacific Coast Highway. We had a list on a notepad stuck to the refrigerator. We had 2 children. Our son, Miles, was 31 when his father passed. Our daughter, Connie, was 28. They were both living their own lives by then. Miles in Charlotte with his wife Joanna and their baby girl, Connie in Portland, single, working at a marketing firm she seemed to love. The grief was enormous in those first months. That's not a complaint, that's just what it was. Frank and I had been married 34 years. You don't grieve a man like that quickly or quietly. I cried in the grocery store. I cried in the car. I cried standing in the backyard in January because I had forgotten to bring in his bird feeder before the first freeze, and somehow that felt like the worst thing I had ever done. Miles called every Sunday for a while. Connie came to stay with me for 2 weeks in the summer, and I thought, foolishly, I see now, that we were going to be all right. The 3 of us. That losing Frank had pulled us together the way loss sometimes does. I should tell you about the house. It was a 4-bedroom colonial in Greensboro, North Carolina. Frank and I bought it in 1988 when Miles was 15 and Connie was 12. We refinished the hardwood floors ourselves. I planted a rose garden along the back fence that took 3 years to come in properly. The kitchen was too small and we always said we'd expand it someday, and we never did. I loved that house the way you love something you've worked for, not just the building. The life inside it. When Miles called me in the fall of 2005, about 18 months after Frank died, he said he and Joanna were struggling financially. His company had downsized. The baby was almost 2. Joanna wasn't working. He asked if they could come stay with me for a little while, just until he got back on his feet. I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. They arrived in November with a U-Haul truck, 2 dogs, the baby, and more furniture than my house could reasonably hold. I moved my sewing room into a corner of the master bedroom, so little Haley could have her own space. I didn't say anything about it. I was glad to have the noise back in the house, honestly. Glad to have someone at the dinner table. But Joanna, I want to be fair here, because I have had 17 years to think about this, and I have tried very hard to be fair. Joanna was not happy from the first week. She was polite in the way that people are polite when they are keeping score. She rearranged my kitchen cabinets without asking me. She bought new towels for the guest bathroom and put mine in a bag for Goodwill. Small things. Things I told myself didn't matter. Miles saw none of it. Or he chose not to see it. By the following spring, Joanna was pregnant again. They were still there. Miles had found work, but the salary wasn't what he'd hoped, he said. The housing market was bad, he said. I understood. I kept understanding. Every time I started to feel that tightness in my chest, that sense that something was being slowly taken from me, I reminded myself that this was my son, my grandchildren, family. I made a mistake in 2007. I put Miles's name on the deed to the house. My sister Loretta told me not to. She drove up from Savannah specifically to sit at my kitchen table and tell me it was a bad idea. She was 62 years old, sharp as a tack, and she had spent 25 years working in real estate. She said, Evelyn, I love Miles, but don't do this. I did it anyway. Miles had come to me with paperwork, something about refinancing to get a lower interest rate, and there was a section that added him as co-owner, and I signed it because he explained it to me, and I trusted him, and I was 63 years old and tired, and I thought I was doing something kind. Loretta didn't speak to me about it for 3 months. I thought she was being dramatic. By 2008, there were 4 of them living in my house. Miles, Joanna, Haley, and the new baby, a boy they named Derek. I was sleeping in my own bedroom, but the rest of the house had gradually become theirs. Their photos on the walls, their furniture in the living room. My rose garden was the only thing left that felt entirely mine, and only because Joanna had no interest in gardening. The conversation happened on a Wednesday. Miles sat me down at the my kitchen table, and told me that he and Joanna had been talking, and they felt the house was getting crowded, and that it might be better for everyone if I found my own place. He used the phrase, better for everyone, 3 times. I counted. I asked him whose house he thought he was sitting in. He showed me the deed. I stared at it for a long time. Then I said, very quietly, that I wanted them out by the end of the month. Joanna appeared in the doorway. She must have been listening. She said that she had spoken to a lawyer, and that as co-owner Miles had every right to remain in the property, and that if I wanted to pursue it, I could. But it would mean a long legal process, and did I really want to do that to my grandchildren? Haley was 3. Derek was 11 months old. I left. I know that's the past that makes people angry. I've read the comments on other stories like mine, and I know the first thing people say, why didn't you fight? Why did you just walk away? I want to explain it as honestly as I can. I was 64 years old. I was still grieving. I had just watched my daughter-in-law hold my grandchildren like a shield between us. And something in me, something tired and sad and not yet finished with being kind, made the calculation that no house was worth what that fight would cost me. Not because I was weak, but because I looked at Miles's face across that table and I did not recognize him, and that was already a loss so large I could barely breathe through it. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in High Point, about 45 minutes away. I called Connie. She cried on the phone and said she couldn't believe it, and that Miles should be ashamed of himself. And I believed her because what else do you do? She visited twice that first year. Then once. Then cards at Christmas. The silence came gradually. Miles stopped calling. There was no single dramatic moment, no final argument, no door slammed shut. He just slowly stopped being present in my life until one day I realized I hadn't spoken to him in 4 months, and I didn't know the names of my grandchildren's teachers, or what Haley's favorite color was, or whether Derek was walking yet. Connie eventually stopped too. She called less. Her visits stopped entirely after she met someone and moved to Seattle. We stayed in touch through text for a while, brief, friendly, meaningless texts. Then even those became rare. By 2012, I was effectively alone. I won't pretend those years were easy. They weren't. There were nights I sat in that apartment and felt something I can only describe as erased. Like I had existed for the benefit of other people, wife, mother, grandmother, and once those people no longer needed me in the way they once had, I had simply become optional, something you put in a closet when company isn't coming. But here is the thing about being erased. You find out what's actually there. I started volunteering at a literacy center. I took a watercolor class at the community center and discovered I was surprisingly not terrible at it. I made friends, real ones, the kind you make when you have nothing to prove and no role to perform. A woman named Harriet who had survived breast cancer twice and laughed louder than anyone I'd ever met. A retired postmaster named Gus who grew tomatoes and left bags of them at my door every August without ever asking for anything in return. I built a life, a quiet one, a real one. And Loretta, my sister who had told me not to put Miles on the deed, who had been so angry with me. Loretta came back, gradually, the way the best people do. She drove up from Savannah for my birthday 2 years in a row. We started talking on the phone every Sunday the way Miles used to. She never said I told you so, not once. By 2018, Loretta was the closest person in my life. She was 73 and she had the kind of energy that makes 73 feel like 50. She was still working part-time, still arguing with her HOA, still driving herself to the grocery store and the doctor and wherever else she pleased. Then, in the fall of 2019, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. I drove to Savannah and I didn't come home for 8 months. I stayed in her spare bedroom and I drove her to chemo and I made her eat when she didn't want to eat and I watched her get smaller in her chair in the way that people do when the medicine is fighting harder than the body. She was stubborn about it in the most Loretta way possible. She kept her lipstick on through the worst of it. She had opinions about everything. She told her oncologist that his bedside manner needed work, and I watched his face and I thought, she is going to be fine, because nobody that difficult can be dying. She passed on a Sunday morning in May of 2020. The will was read 2 weeks later. I sat in Loretta's attorney's office in downtown Savannah, a man named Ogden, very calm, very precise, and I listened to him explain that Loretta had left everything to me. The house, the savings account, the contents, the car, everything. Loretta had never married. No children. She had a distant cousin on her ex-husband's side who had sent a card when she got sick, but no one close. Just me. And she had, apparently, been planning this for years. Mr. Ogden slid a letter across the desk, handwritten, in Loretta's very particular cursive, and I'll tell you what she wrote later. But when I read it sitting in that office, I cried in a way I hadn't cried since Frank died. The house was appraised at $610,000. The savings account held just over $280,000. The total estate was worth close to $900,000. I was not prepared for that. Loretta had always lived modestly. The house was old but well maintained. She had inherited it from our parents and paid off the mortgage decades ago. The savings were from a lifetime of careful, quiet work. She had simply never spent it, and she had spent the last year of her life making sure it went to me. I moved to Savannah. I hired a contractor to update the kitchen and the primary bathroom. I planted flowers along the front walk. Not roses this time, dahlias, something new. I hung my own watercolors on the walls. I bought furniture I actually liked. It was the first time in 15 years that I had a home that felt entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. Then, 11 months after Loretta's will was settled, Miles knocked on my door. I knew something had happened before he said a word. He had the look of a man who has practiced his expression in the car mirror on the way over. Sad but hopeful, repentant, but not quite sure how repentant to be until he gauged my reaction. Joanna was not with him. He had driven down from Charlotte alone, which told me the visit was strategic. He said he had heard about Loretta. He said he was sorry for my loss. He said he had been thinking about me a lot lately. He said, and this is the part where I had to press my thumbnail into my palm to keep my face still. He said he hoped we could start over. I invited him inside. I made coffee. I let him talk. He talked for a long time. He talked about how hard the last few years had been, which I noted had nothing to do with me, or with what he had done. He talked about Haley and Derek and how much they had grown, which I noted was also true, but was not an apology. He mentioned that Joanna had changed, that she was different now, that she felt terrible about how things had happened. I waited. Eventually he got to the point. He said he had spoken to a family attorney. He said that as my son, and given the circumstances of our estrangement, he felt that there might be a conversation to be had about Loretta's estate. He didn't use the word inheritance. He used the phrase, what's fair to everyone. He said Connie had also been trying to reach me. I checked my phone after he left. There were indeed 3 texts from Connie over the previous 2 weeks, all warm, all asking how I was doing. 13 years of silence. Then 3 texts, and a Sunday afternoon visit from a son I barely recognized. I looked at Miles across Loretta's kitchen table, my kitchen table now, and I thought about the deed. I thought about Joanna standing in the doorway with Derek on her hip. I thought about every Sunday phone call that stopped, every Christmas card that didn't come. I thought about Harriet and Gus and watercolor class and dahlias in the front garden and the 8 months I spent in that spare bedroom watching my sister get smaller. I thought about what Loretta had written in her letter. You were the one who showed up, Evelyn. You were always the one who showed up. Build something beautiful with this. You've earned every single dollar. I said to Miles very calmly that I had something to show him. I walked to the writing desk in the hallway, Loretta's desk, dark walnut, one of the few pieces of furniture I had kept exactly where it was, and I took out an envelope. Inside was a letter from my own attorney, a woman named Ms. Myers, Whitfield here in Savannah, who I had retained shortly after the estate settled. On Miss Whitfield's advice, I had placed the entirety of Loretta's estate into an irrevocable trust. My name. No beneficiaries listed that Miles would recognize. I had also, and Miss Whitfield had suggested this almost gently, as if she had seen this particular situation more than once. I had also contacted a notary and had my own will drafted and witnessed and filed. The estate would go to 3 organizations: the Literacy Center, where I had volunteered in High Point, a hospice foundation in Savannah that had sent a volunteer to sit with Loretta in her final weeks, and a scholarship fund at the small college where Loretta had earned her real estate license 50 years ago. I handed Miles the trust document summary. I watched him read it. He read it twice. Then he looked up at me, and I saw the moment, the precise, identifiable moment when he understood, not just that there was no money to be had, but that I had known he was coming, that I had prepared, that whoever he thought he was visiting, the lonely, grieving mother, the woman who could be moved by coffee and practiced apologies and photographs of grandchildren I had never met, that woman had not answered the door. He said, quietly, that he hadn't come just for the money. I said, "Miles, I'm your mother. I know exactly why you came." He sat with that for a moment. Then he asked if there was any chance of repairing things. Just the 2 of us. No talk of money. I want to tell you that I felt something break open when he said that. I want to tell you I cried, that I reached across Loretta's kitchen table and took his hand, that we found our way back to each other. People want that ending. I know they do because I used to want it myself. But here is what I have learned after 77 years of being alive and 63 of them paying close attention. There are people in your life who are there because they choose to be there, and there are people who are there because of what you have. When the second kind loses access to what you have, they don't become the first kind. They just go find somewhere else to stand. I told Miles that I wished him well. I told him I hoped Derek and Haley were thriving. I told him that if he ever needed to talk to someone, genuinely talk, not negotiate, he could call me. Then I walked into the door. He stood on the front porch for a moment. Loretta's front porch, now mine, with the dahlias coming in along the walk. And he looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Not angry, not quite sad, something more like someone who has miscalculated a distance and now has to figure out how to walk back. He said, "I didn't think you'd be like this." I said, "I know. That's the thing about people you abandon. You stop updating your picture of them." I watched him get in his car. I watched him drive away. Then I went back inside and I called Harriet, and she picked up on the second ring. And when I told her what had just happened, she laughed that enormous laugh of hers and said, "Evelyn Marsh, I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life." I made myself a cup of tea. I sat in Loretta's reading chair by the window, her chair, dark green velvet, the armrests worn smooth, and I looked at the dahlias in the evening night. Connie sent another text 3 days later. I read it carefully. It was warm, and it was kind, and it said all the right things. I thought about her for a long time before I responded. I thought about the Portland visits that stopped, the Christmas cards that stopped, the years of optional friendship I had offered, and she had accepted only when it was convenient. I wrote back a short message. I said I was well. I said I hoped she was too. I said that if she ever wanted a real conversation, not a transaction, a real one, I was here. She hasn't responded to that. It's been a while now. Maybe she will. I don't spend much time waiting. Here is what I know to be true. Loretta spent the last year of her life leaving me something. Not just money, though I will not pretend the money didn't matter. It mattered enormously. It changed the architecture of my entire remaining life. But something larger. She spent the last year of her life choosing me, deliberately, specifically, with a handwritten letter and a careful attorney and decades of savings she had never touched. After so many years of being unchosen, of being the person who was put down when someone found something better to hold, Loretta chose me. And when Miles sat across that table in his practiced sadness, the only thing I felt clearly, underneath the complicated grief of a son I had lost long before that afternoon, was gratitude. That I had known. That I had been ready. That when the knock came, I had already decided who I was. I still live in Savannah. The dahlias come back every year now. Better than the first year, the way good things often do once they've had time to settle into the soil. Harriet visited last spring and we sat on the porch for 3 hours and talked about everything and nothing. Gus still leaves tomatoes, except now he dries them down from High Point in August and stays for the weekend, and we eat on the back patio and watch the evening come in over the live oaks. I am 77 years old. I wake up every morning in a house that is entirely, uncomplicatedly mine, and I think of Loretta in her lipstick, and I think of Frank on the day we closed on that house in Greensboro with the too small kitchen, and I think of the notepad on the refrigerator with the list of things we were going to do someday. Some of them I've done on my own. Some of them I'll never do now. Most days I'm all right with that. What I am not is waiting, not for Miles to become someone different, not for Connie to decide I'm worth the conversation, not for anyone to show up and tell me my life has been enough. It has been enough. More than enough. Loretta told me so. I've thought a lot about the word deserve since that afternoon. Miles sat across from me at Loretta's kitchen table. People use it in both directions. Children who've been hurt say their parents deserved what came to them. Parents who've been abandoned wonder what they did to deserve it. And somewhere in the middle of all that is the quieter, more uncomfortable truth. Most of what happens to us isn't about deserving at all. It's about choices. A long, unbroken chain of choices, yours and other people's, that eventually lead you to a specific door on a specific afternoon with a specific look on your face. Miles made his choices. I made mine. Joanna made hers. And Loretta, quietly, over decades, made hers. What I've come to understand, not quickly, not easily, but clearly, is that the people who show up when there's nothing to gain are the only ones you can truly count. That's not a judgment. That's just arithmetic. Loretta drove up from Savannah to sit at my kitchen table and tell me not to put Miles's name on that deed. She didn't do it because she wanted something from me. She did it because she had watched me for decades, and she knew what I couldn't yet see about my own situation. That's what wisdom actually looks like. Not grand pronouncements, not lessons delivered at the right moment. Just a woman driving 4 hours to tell her sister the truth and then loving her anyway when she didn't listen. I didn't listen. I paid for that. 13 years of paying for it, in loneliness and small apartments and holidays spent with people who were kind but who were not family. But here is the thing I want you to sit with. I also grew because of it. I found Harriet. I found Gus. I found watercolor classes and literacy volunteers and Sunday mornings that belonged entirely to me. I built something out of what was left, and what I built turned out to be sturdier than anything I had before. Because I built it without anyone's permission and without anyone's help, and that means it could never be taken the same way. There is a kind of strength you can only develop by being left alone with yourself long enough to find out who you actually are without the roles. Wife, mother, grandmother, those are real things, and they mattered. But they are not the whole of a person. When Miles and Connie stopped calling, I had to discover what remained of Evelyn Marsh when nobody needed her for anything. What I found was someone I genuinely liked. Someone with opinions about paint colours, and enough stubbornness to start over at 64, and enough sense to hire a good attorney before her son came back with practiced apologies. That's what I mean when I say I was ready when the knock came. Readiness isn't luck. It's what happens when you've spent years paying attention to yourself, to the people who actually love you, to the difference between someone choosing you and someone needing you. Miles wasn't wrong that I had changed. I just hadn't changed into what he was expecting. He came looking for the woman who had signed her own house over because she was tired and trusting and wanted to believe the best of her child. That woman had learned some things. What I hope, for anyone listening who recognizes something of their own life in this story, I hope you're learning things too. I hope you're watching carefully who shows up when there's nothing in it for them. I hope you're building something that's yours, quietly and without waiting for permission. And I hope that when the knock comes, because it usually does eventually, once the money appears, you already know exactly where the letter from your attorney is. Loretta knew I'd need it someday. She just made sure I'd be the kind of woman who thought to get it.